I've certainly treated murderers, and I've even had cases where I've treated someone and they've gone on to murder, which is challenging because you feel complete failure as a psychologist.
Today's podcast is with Professor Bruce Stevens from Sturt University. It's an absolute pleasure to have him on because he's been a huge influence in my career, particularly in my early years, and so it's great to touch base with him again. You're going to love it. There's lots of laughs. There's heaps of experience that we're going to get from Bruce, particularly in the forensic world and working with psychopaths and the like, so you're going to love this. And before you go, make sure you reach out and connect with me on neshnikolic.com/LinkedIn.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Really excited today to have Professor Bruce Stevens from Sturt University. It's an absolute honour, and to give a little bit of a background, many years ago now, I was a student at University of Canberra, and Bruce lectured me, and I think quite fondly it was one of the most great sort of moments of the starting of my career, because I saw someone walking with so much passion, particularly for forensic psychology, and kind of took us through some experiential moments in our work rather than just the theoretical background. With the wealth of experience, it was fantastic to kind of get that starting point in my early education and career. And following that, I remember as a young man and somewhat geeky, trying to ask, in a polite way, whether Bruce would be kind enough to do some supervision with me, and he did so, and so I'm absolutely honoured. He's really shaped a lot of my practice as well, and I recall him sort of suggesting, have you ever decided to get into or thought about getting into relationship counselling? And although I hesitated at the start, he encouraged me and actually introduced me to acceptance and commitment therapy as well.
I didn't know that.
You mentioned that, and I looked it up, and here we are today. So it's a great honour to have Bruce here, and in particular to be talking about, I suppose, where it all started, where we met through forensic psychology.
Well, Nesh, it's actually really a pleasure to see one of my students go far beyond what we were doing and become really a very well-known in Australia practitioner of and giving workshops, and now establishing an enormously impressive practice. So that's the real pleasure, is to see someone blossom and flourish, which you've obviously have.
Thank you very much. It's I think we get inspired every once in a while in our lives, and certainly hence why it's so great to have you here today. And I thought today would be an excellent opportunity to talk about your forensic work. I know that you're doing a lot of work now with relationship counselling, and you've written a recent book on schema therapy in the relationship context, and maybe we touch on that a little bit later on as well. So maybe just if you spend a little bit of time talking about how you got into the forensic side, and maybe we can kind of roll into some of your experiences, and probably maybe even touch on a little bit of the psychopathy space, because that's always, in that world of I remember fondly in our early days talking about that.
Look, I got into forensic because I like to write, and it is a way of expressing opinion through written form. Most of the private practice forensic work most of the public forensic is probably in prisons or some sort of correctional services. But when you're doing private forensic work, you're working directly to lawyers, often on the defence side. So in other words, if a person's committed a crime, you write a report that it tries to explain why they committed it and gives some ideas of what would be helpful for rehabilitation. So I've done that, but there's many areas covered by forensic, but all of them in private practice are basically writing reports. So like counterfeiters, we deal with paper. But so the forensic covers areas like someone slipping on a banana peel and injuring their neck and suing, say, McDonald's because it was their banana peel. Or it could be an immigration case, or family care and protection cases where people are assessed for parental competence. So there's a vast range of what goes under forensic, but I believe it's very important to to be both forensic and clinical in your approach, which I am. And I enjoyed it for like 25, 30 years, writing family law reports and just about everything. I wrote a lot of offender reports, and I probably, over my years, I've written 2,000 or 3,000 reports really. So it's been a big area. And also I got a chance to train people in forensic psychology who did internships, or students who came in as registrars or whatever else. So it was both a hands-on, and it was a place that psychological opinion is highly valued by the courts. So in other words, I remember someone said to me, you play God. Well, it feels like that at times because you're giving an opinion that affects whether a mother can care for a child, or, with supervision or without supervision. And so it's enormous responsibility. So it's a really nice use of clinical and psychological knowledge.
I can't imagine that sort of weight on my shoulders with regards to giving an opinion, particularly in those in those sort of situations. And maybe because being a new father, I'm so close to it at the moment. How have you kind of worked through that and managed that yourself? In the law
helps you because it gives you the criteria to actually make the judgment on. For example, it is the best interest of a child. And some parents are completely incapable of caring for children. So in fact, the decision's not hard. I remember someone said to their kids, I'm going to the shops for some cigarettes, and they had kids like 3 and 5 years old. They went off and got heroin and didn't come back for 2 or 3 days. After 2 days, the children were hungry naturally and went next door and said, Mummy's not here anymore. So can we have some food? Well, I mean, that kind of decision is easy to make.
That makes sense. That makes sense in terms of, in actual fact, going back to that emotional space, you're looking after the kids in their best interest. And if it was going to be best with their mother, then that's what would be, I suppose, considered. But in that case, definitely that level of neglect.
Sometimes you actually get the wonderful case of a mother who turns around her life for a father and can care for children. So it doesn't happen a whole lot, but it does happen. And it happens. And some of those stories of people recovering from heroin to look after their children or alcoholism, in fact, it's just a joy to write those reports and to congratulate the mother on the turnaround and say, now you are competent to care for children. So an example of that, or someone who gets charged with some offence and turns their life around and then gets out of the criminal world, for example, is another joy. So you do see some great benefits. It's not all despair and just sort of repetition of crime after crime or problem after problem. You do see some changes, and that too is a delight. But realistically, you've got a range.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the ethical dilemmas that you've had to deal with over the years? I know that sometimes it can be complex as a psychologist trying to hold our code of ethics, in line with what we're trying to serve, which is, the person, the client, the community, and I suppose in the forensic world at times, the court. We're trying to serve the court.
The courts actually have an ethical code which you actually have to comply with over and above any other ethical code. For example, you've got to report in an objective way, not advocating for the patient or the client. You've got to actually report to the court. So sometimes it's delicate because you've got to say you're seeing a private patient and they want you to write a legal report, and you believe they have a personality disorder, say, well, that has to go in the report if it's relevant to the legal issue. So yes, there are complexities, but there are clear guidelines, and with supervision and someone with experience, you can thread your way through those dilemmas. But you have to warn your patient that once you ask me for a legal report, I'm actually obliged to the court, and I can't be because they'll naively think it's all about you advocating for me and telling the court how wonderful I am, that I would never embezzle money or whatever. and no sensible psychologist would be so uncritical.
Sure. So in some sense, that's where it can get tricky, in that someone might initially present and build rapport. I'm kind of thinking maybe there's a personality that might go out and do so quite actively, and then kind of drop the drop the penny around, can you write a report for me?
It happens, but not as often as you think. Usually lawyers are in fact referring people to me to write it. Sure. And often you're looking at a pretty, they say in criminal assessment, someone's done a really terrible crime and you're trying to think of anything that might just help the court understand what was actually happening for the person. It might have been desperation, a spouse had left them, or they were went back on the alcohol, drugs, or whatever else. So you try and say, well, look, they are drug dependent, but they've never given a good residential program a go. So let's see what happens if we can take that out of the mix and see whether they can function better, say, without some sort of drug dependence. So, yeah, it's straightforward in that sense.
Sure.
Or depression. Maybe I should try medication for depression. So, or something like that. So you come up with some options the court can try. Because generally the court are trying to keep people out of jail and give them a chance to get their act together. I mean, the courts are generally understanding and not trying to just be purely punitive.
Mm-hmm. What would you say some of the more interesting characters you've met over your time have been like? Are you able to talk about that at all?
I don't think I can really say much that would be in any way identifying, but I've certainly treated murderers, and I've even had cases where I've treated someone and they've gone on to murder, which is challenging because you feel complete failure as a psychologist, thinking, well, whatever homicidal impulses they had that were not cured by Bruce Stevens. So that's humbling and probably in some sense humiliating.
That's the case for a lot of us, isn't it? I actually remember having supervision, talking with you about grief and saying, I don't think I'm doing anything, Bruce, I need to be doing something more active. I'm not helping this person. They still feel, terrible. And obviously the, wisdom of, being patient, and I'm probably one of the only few people in their life that is listening and hearing them out,
yes,
and,
exactly.
and being a compassionate ear. But you sometimes feel helpless or that you haven't kind of achieved anything. But
well, I think it happens in every form of therapy, actually. So couple therapy, you just see people think I've got a slug gun and I've got an elephant in the room. So, what am I doing here? Look, it's we have to have some humility as psychologists.
Absolutely. You've treated, people from all walks of life. Is it hard from a treatment perspective, looking at, I suppose, how to support someone who's maybe come out of the, legal system or the punitive system? They're trying to rebuild their life, whether it be, someone who's done some horrible things like murder or rape or
I've seen all
abuse.
of that. I think the hardest people are the folk that are really permanently labelled as sex offenders because they're often on a register for 15 years, depending on the jurisdiction. And sometimes, it's very hard because you get to know them as real people, not just an offender. And so how do you balance that, realistically helping them to recover and to make it safe for children anywhere in the vicinity to be around them? But on the other hand, to recognise that you find people likeable and you want to work with them and find the best in them. And often people are just people. We're all, some ways we fall short of whatever our ideals are. But that's a tricky one because there's so much negative press and so much pent-up attitudes, especially in the light of royal commissions, and I've seen clergy who've offended and whatever else. It is really very challenging to help people in really, it's a bit like putting up a tent in a hurricane or something. It's not easy. And so anyone that works in this area, feels the agony of the offender as well, and so they should.
Mm-hmm. That's something that, once again, going back to our supervision, you probably don't realise how much of a positive impression you had on me and in my career. But I do remember when I was working with someone who had allegations against them of sexual misconduct and of a minor. And I remember you talking about trying to remain compassionate and try and hear the person behind that. And that was difficult for me because I was a young man to start off with. You know, there's so much conflict inside, but I think I really took those words on and have worked quite strongly to try and see the human being. And in actual fact, these days, in some sense, I think about it as someone who has an urge in their life that is not allowed to ever be fulfilled based on our laws, and that's completely understandable. But to have to live with something that you can never go out and express can be quite difficult, and there's suffering that goes along with that.
I think there is, and I'm glad you can really hear that and empathise with it, because to me, you've got to be on their side. I mean, therapy can't be punitive. It can never be punitive, in my opinion. Though there are schools of thought that, you know, with offenders, therapy is punitive. So, I mean, to me, it's a bizarre way of thinking, and it's maybe I'm controversial, but I think therapy can never be punitive. You've got to be alongside. And I'm glad that you've taken that from whatever those early supervision sessions and, of course, gone to find your own identity as a therapist, and that's wonderful. I'm proud of you.
Well, thank you. Why do you think it's so difficult for us as human beings to see that perspective?
Look, I actually don't know. I think what helps me is to realise how flawed I am. I start from that, basically. There's no one more or less flawed than me. I mean, there's some crimes I couldn't do. I couldn't torture an animal or something like that. You know, I mean, I just can't imagine doing that. But I could do crimes. I could be antisocial, and if my family were different, I could have grown up in a situation which I'm the perpetrator and I'm the outcast. So I find the flaws in myself, and then it helps me to be accepting of others. That's how I do it.
I think that's absolutely beautiful. The recognizing that we are all at risk of absorbing our context.
Yes, exactly.
And these people need to be understood in their context. You know, whether it's a boy that shoplifts something from a grocery store, or whether it's someone who goes out and, you know, physically assaults someone in a brutal way. There has to be a history. There has to be a context that tells us more about that person than, you know, that one punch or that one theft.
Exactly.
Psychopaths, or that psychopathy, or that personality disorder. Can you talk about that and how that plays out in the world of the forensic world? I imagine you see people who are either in that category, so to speak, or hold some of those characteristics. I think you've kind of described it in beautiful ways before. I remember you talking about the traits and how people think rather than, you know, checklist type of scenario. Do you mind maybe talking a little bit about that?
Let me say, one time I actually diagnosed psychopathy before seeing the person.
Okay.
It was someone who was at one of the prisons, and and I'd heard when I'd sent one of my associates. Now, this associate was a very pretty young girl who could have been a Vogue model. I mean, she was really, by our standards of, I know this sounds sexist, but it's important for the story.
Sure.
She was very beautiful and carried herself very well. And when she went to do the initial interview, which I had with some of my associates at the time, the person who she went to was a male, and he was disappointed to see her. Now, at that point, you know, your mouth drops open. And I mean, this guy in prison seeing probably, you know, someone, you know, as beautiful as she was. And he said, "Oh, where's Dr. Stevens? I've been reading his book on narcissism and I want to meet him." So I thought, wow. But the way that I pick the psychopath is often easy to pick in a prison. The trick is to pick them in real life, and they could be an executive at IBM or something like that, you know. So picking them in a different context where you don't expect it is difficult. What I notice is, and I'll use a cricket analogy, everything is spun. It's a bit like facing Shane Warne as a bowler, it's just everything spins in a certain way. And after a while, you can pick a bit of that. That sort of, there's other qualities like reptilian, a sort of lack of arousal until you almost got a machine gun in your hands or something. So there's lots of criteria that Robert Hare has identified, and that's what he called the Hare checklist. And of course, you can look that up and Google that. But it's really that spinning, or everything that spins in a certain direction, usually using you or getting you to manipulate you in a sense, but it's more subtle even than that. It's more like just everything is utilitarian. It's used for purpose, and the instrumental relationship. Someone like Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, said it's an I-it relationship, and you know it when you're the it. It's not your I-you or something like that. It's an I-it relationship. So these are some of the indicators. But probably about a quarter of people in prison population have got strong traits of psychopathy. So it's not unusual. I have treated people who are psychopaths. And I remember once, if you remember Dr. Murphy and Tony Soprano, if you ever saw that series, it was very much like a Tony Soprano type people I've seen over the years, often running some sort of criminal empires in their own way. And so that's been... I felt like Dr. Murphy, in the situation with Tony Soprano. So, and Tony's a good psychopath because he's likable. He's very sort of friendly guy. He's a bit neurotic, if you remember the series. And
there's something about the charming nature.
There is something about the charm, but also at the wrong moment, he'll kill you without blinking. So there's an animal reptilian quality and a sort of instrument. And the other thing is that instrumental use of violence is very striking. It's like the aggression is not like, the borderline personality disorder, which explodes everywhere. It's more like it's instrumental, just enough menace or aggression to make you do what they need you to do. So it feels cold and calculated.
It's almost very functional to the utility.
It's very functional.
Yeah, to what they want to get out of that.
They want something out of you, and that's freaky.
Yeah. I think I recall an example that you gave. And I'll slightly change it to make sure it is de-identified, and I'm sure you would have at the time, but where you spoke about a particular person who had formed a relationship wanting to get revenge on someone, but formed a relationship with a friend of theirs over many years. And it was a business sort of relationship to effectively one day get back at them.
Get the revenge,
to get the revenge. And it was very, very calculated and thought through.
Yes.
But it went to the nth degree. It was quite interesting that someone would go to that length because, I wouldn't often go out and consider, would someone actually go out and do that? It's almost like it's stuck in their mind. They're obsessed around it, but they're not obsessed and impulsive. Obsessed and calculated.
Well, that's characteristic of that sort of person. You can hear it in some of the phrases, that once was spoken by a psychopath. There's a sucker born every minute. That's a classic, conning, manipulative, predatorial sort of thing. Or what else? Revenge is best served cold. It's a dish best served cold. This sort of thing. I mean, these are psychopathic statements. They're coming from the person who is out to con. Or we all get contacts, the Nigerian scammers
are
psychopaths, or the people that ring you on the phone, So, these are scammers are classic psychopaths.
Have you ever found yourself down the yellow brick road, so to speak, with a psychopath where, some months later you're like, my goodness, am I being manipulated here?
Yes, and in fact, Robert Hare, who is the world authority on psychopaths, he acknowledges that he's been conned many times. So you're very, very foolish if you don't think you're going to be conned by a psychopath. I mean, they are good at what they do. Yes, I remember once I did a criminal assessment on someone, and I absolutely thought that this person was the genuine article. It was a criminal compensation case over, I think, a rape case. And later on, I was totally surprised. She managed to fake the testing, faked every part of it, and actually got, let's say, $50,000 on compensation. And it was later found out it was completely manufactured. I'd been conned, and she went to jail for that offence. So,
wow.
So it is, you can't, you can be conned. Again, it's your modesty on your, not being arrogant will at least save you some measure of embarrassment when you realise that you could be conned. And they're smarter than you at times, so that's true.
Smarter than the testing as well.
Even the testing, which is pretty objective, yes. It's impressive result, isn't it?
Yeah, because they do validity scales in those tests and so on. So, we're supposed to be able to catch it in the test.
I know. Well, this one I missed. That's happened a few times to me too.
Yeah, wow. I suppose in some sense it's humbling as well to find those flaws again, to kind of say, it gives me some measures about we can all be flawed. I can't necessarily see everything, and that people can be masterful, and that's what psychopathy can be, masterful in that art.
Well, it's probably a survival technique. Someone said that if you're in a concentration camp and the guards have all the power, you learn how to manipulate them.
Yeah.
And that's what you do. So, yes, I think we need to be modest as psychologists. We don't have all knowledge. We're not omniscient. We're just simply human beings doing the best we can.
On a lighter note, can you tell me a little bit about some of the more positive aspects of what you've kind of found in your world, where people have, you mentioned before, people have turned things around. I'm not sure whether from a personality disorder type space or
sometimes
from other contexts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, let me say the thing I find the most value in. I think every clinician, often with the easier people, finds them easy to help them. The difficult cases are obviously the most challenging, but, and then most people who come to a psychologist have got got problems that are too big for them, but aren't too big for a relationship and working together. So, in fact, most of the cases we see, it's easy to help people, and any experienced clinician, yourself or myself, can actually help people. And it's a pleasure to see it because the problems feel big. I often feel it's a bit like coming with a block of cement in their lap when they're sitting in the waiting room, and we just chip at it and eventually it gets manageable. So most people are easily helped. The thing that gives me the greatest joy, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to hear what you said tonight, is the working with more junior psychologists when I was teaching and running a Clin Psych program. I absolutely love that work. It wasn't easy at the university. The administration was never easy, but the students were a delight. And I just loved seeing people get over their initial anxiety, how strange it was to be a therapist, and the absolute very bright students who are not only IQ, very high, but emotional intelligence plus. And seeing them just flourish and blossom in their work as a therapist, seeing them just love what they do, it's been probably the greatest joy of my life.
Yeah, wow. Well, I think we certainly did enjoy it and felt that from you as students. It was quite refreshing to have you coming from your private practice work, to teach us. We felt we were closer to that world, that we could live it and breathe it and see it. And there was one class I remember where I think we all had to go out and prepare for a case to be cross-examined.
Oh, yes.
And I think you were actually releasing your book Crossfire around about that time, or maybe it was after that you released it. But we were going around the classroom being cross-examined and then kind of looking at it from that sort of perspective. And it was really fascinating to see how that world, forensic world or that legal world, touches the psychological world, and the way we've got to look at it with objective eyes rather than subjective eyes. Even the way we speak is important.
Well, you're an experienced workshop presenter, and I'm sure you use experiential and to make it real. And that's all I did as my classes. I just made it as real and as experiential as I could. And you don't forget that. That's the learning you don't forget. whether it's in schema therapy or acceptance commitment therapy. It is an experiential therapy. I talk about it as working hot.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you're actually working, not talking about a problem. You work hot in the problem.
Yeah.
So it's experiential, whether it's 2-chair work, or I know there's just dozens of techniques in ACT therapy as well. So working hot. So you don't work cold and rational and talking about it, but experiential is the growing edge is often experience.
Kelly Wilson often talks about find where it hurts and go there and sit there.
You can sit there, you be with the person where it's painful.
It's kind of wet. That's where it's hot.
That's where it's hot. That's the hot conversation.
Going back a little bit to your work in therapy with, let's say, someone who has been released from jail.
Right.
How do you go into those hot areas? What is it that's difficult for them, so to speak? Is it transitioning back into the quote, air quotes, real world? Is it how do they live with what's occurred? How do they go out and reconcile with family, with friends? What's hot in those spaces?
Well, I think it's hot is to avoid the old patterns, the criminal thinking, and it's just so easy, to go back to start busting again with the drugs or whatever else. I mean, it's just like, to them, it's like a big smorgasbord banquet almost, of what they haven't been able to do for the last 5 years. So look, it is tough, and relationships are tough, and a lot of people just basically go through the revolving door and are back inside. So, I mean, it is actually really hard. I don't do a lot of work with that except with offenders, and generally the offenders are highly motivated to not go back because it's such a punitive experience. I think you should probably talk to Professor Doug Bauer sometime. He does a lot of work with people who are offending, and I think he's a world expert in some forms of offending. So he would be worth you having a chat to.
Great. We'll definitely reach out. What do you think about this idea of this revolving door? Do people go out and reoffend to get back on the inside? Are they doing that? I've heard that so much. I have no experience in this world around that. Is that something that genuinely happens, or are we talking more about someone's lacking impulse control, and which probably got them into jail the first time, and so they go back out and it's difficult to develop those skills, and you get caught up in the wrong crowd, and on and on you go. What's your take on it?
A little bit of all of the above, I think, actually happens. I mean, I think some people are institutionalized. It's fairly comfortable for them to be in jail. It's a place they belong, and they don't have to worry about their next meal. So look, there's some benefits in that sense. But I do think that most often it's the ingrained patterns that got them into jail are keeping them returning, unless they do the hard work of breaking those patterns, which is not an easy task. I mean, it is really hard to turn your life around from an offending lifestyle.
Yeah. I've always thought about it in a very, very similar way to going to rehab. The time that you have in rehab lends itself out to doing great work. And so you can go out and work on, what you feel guilty about, and, forgiveness of, yourself, others. You can work on some of the behaviors that have got you into that space and create commitments and so on and so forth. But then you're thrown back into the context, and the context of going back into the real world, so to speak, means that your phone rings and there's a dealer on the other side saying, for no money whatsoever, I'm going to spot you this hit.
Yes, exactly.
And another person calls you and says, hey, it's great to hear you're out. Let's go out and party. And I've got some really good gear.
Or I want to break into something, you can drive for me, or something like that. Look, there's 1,000 temptations. You're right.
Huge amounts.
It really is quite hard. And it really takes a great determination to turn that around. And often the best thing is they have someone who loves them and waits for them, and maybe some children. I mean, sometimes that provides a motivation to make that big change. So sometimes the magistrate said, well, what can I do for this guy? And I would say, well, the evidence says get them married. or get them in a relationship there. It sounds bizarre, but I mean, I know magistrates aren't marriage brokers, but nevertheless, that's what the evidence is. You're most likely to stop offending when it counts.
Bring back arranged marriages. Right?
Exactly. I fully support that. Except I don't know what parents of the bride or the groom, depending on who did the offence, would take a jailbird for a prospective son-in-law or whatever.
There's a social experiment in the making.
It is, I think, yes.
It would be helpful, though, I imagine, a context like that. You're absolutely right, where love comes into effect. I think human beings will do
something
anything,
more, leverage or something.
Yeah.
Children, whatever else. And sometimes they'll do it for kids, yes.
Yeah.
But you do need a lot of leverage.
Yep. Love does that.
I think it can do that.
Yeah, it can. My apologies. It's a nice segue to look at your work with couples, and particularly in that Schema world as well. Tell me a little bit about the work that you do with couples.
Look, I do see a lot of couples. I have written 3 or 4 books in schema therapy, including the first book on couple therapy, the one that I was just saying is in something like 600 university libraries at the moment. So I found that out today, so I'm still proud as that. But
quickly plug the title. What's the title?
It's called Schema Therapy for Couples. So it's
fantastic. Make sure you go
Healing
out there
Relationships, I think it might be called. But I wrote it with Chiara Di Francesco and Eckhard Rodiger. So it has become the first book and schema therapy for couples. Look, I don't do here's an admission, I don't do a lot of schema therapy with couples. I probably, if you looked at my work, it'd be emotion focused. So I tend to take on that. But I will use it with more difficult cases because it's got some powerful therapy techniques which are very helpful for more difficult to treat couples. So I've enjoyed couple therapy over the years. It's always energizing for me, and there's a tremendous amount of reward in working with the higher energy of couple work. So I've loved it. At the moment, I'm trying to write something on the hidden language of love. So.
Tell me a bit about that. If
well,
you
it's
don't mind.
about it's about. I'm interested in precognitive learning, what's called implicit learning, and how that affects relationships. So I'm writing a book at the moment called Before Belief, and it's on infant spirituality, and so it's all linked in there with that early precognitive, pre-language sort of learning, and how that shapes us for relationships or spirituality in later life. So I'm very interested. So that's one of my websites, in fact, is www.earlyspirituality.com. And it's really about the earliest spirituality or spiritual experiences that infants and babies have.
How do you see those two worlds coming together in terms of how do those early experiences shape us?
Well, I see them as a formative, actually. I mean, really they form who we are. It's our identity. And it's often the problem for therapy is that it's non-cognitive. So if someone hates themselves, let's take low self-esteem, which is something I know you've thought about and talked about on your podcasts and things like that. Well, low self-esteem is a feeling about the self. It's not actual words. I mean, a person can later say, I hate myself or I loathe myself. But in fact, the feeling comes first. It's a feeling. And until someone can say, I hate myself, say, and then you can have a counter argument or a counter narrative to that. So you can say, but hold on, your wife loves you, your children adore you, you've got, but it's a bit like the Princess Diana sort of phenomenon. She has everything, but she hates herself, according to the tabloids. I have no idea. But so there's a lot of people that have everything, supposedly, but hate themselves. And it's because of some deficits in the early caring before words. So we've got to give voice to the early learning and then develop a counter narrative. So that's a very exciting way forward. And so, I use techniques like sentence completion and some of those other things to get back to that early learning that's often in the body, it's in the emotions, but it's not cognitive.
What would you say some of those deficits might be?
Well, anything in which a child's needs aren't recognised and actually met. I mean, Jeff Young, who originated schema therapy, talked about child's needs, and actually schema therapy is a needs-based therapy. So if they miss out on getting nurture as a child, then the therapist, in effect, is like a alternate parent who provides some of those needs. And you'd find yourself doing that all the time with your therapy. In other words, you provide what was missing until the person, your patient, can internalize it. Then they don't need the therapist, and then you're finished therapy. But it's that process is actually of internalize, and Freud talked about it. He talked about the internalizing process. So look, it's as long as therapy's been therapy, but it is a very important role for the therapist and to actually step in and provide what was missing. It's called a corrective emotional experience. So you provide it, they integrate it, and they don't need the therapist. That's it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. And that quite often takes time because the cognitive side just does not touch the surface of the emotive human experience.
You have to experience that unconditional acceptance. Carl Rogers, one of your rooms here, I think, are Carl Rogers. You've got Sigmund Freud and a few other rooms here, which are great to walk around. I think that's such a wonderful idea, Nesh, is naming your therapy rooms after the greats. The B.F. Skinner I'm not sure about because I didn't like him and his rats, but he's certainly a great by anybody's estimation. He shaped psychology. But look, yes, no, I think that this is a great challenge for us, and really it's almost magical when we see it happen in therapy. No therapist knows why therapy works. Mm. There is just something that happens, in therapy that, everybody is left speechless at the end of the day, and you never quite know whether you did this or that, but something happened and something worked, and someone who was suicidal, depressed, facing nothing more than the end of their life in their imagination, is actually turned around and finds a joy in living. And why does that happen? I think it's chemistry, it's magic. I have no idea.
It's funny, psychologists often pride themselves in being scientist practitioners, and that's certainly valid because that's exactly what we go out and do. And then there's also some other stuff that we don't know how to explain it.
Exactly.
And so the science doesn't allow us to go out and explain, why does talking actually make it better? Why does someone feeling heard, we talk about it, so it's a cathartic experience, but why?
That's right.
It's difficult for us to actually put something to it. We'll put a narrative, but we can get 10 different people giving 10 different narratives that are inconsistent. We've just put a story to it, but we know it works.
It's way too simplistic to say it's just simply positive thinking or something like that. So that's complete nonsense. But I do think that there is something that's very hard to define. Freud talked about the talking cure, and it's a cure, and it's talking. So somewhere in that mix of giving attention, allowing a person to explore what they hadn't really put into words, and that's really very much there since psychoanalysis, it works. It just works. Any experienced therapist knows it works.
What are your thoughts about, I've been reading a little bit more about epigenetics and how trauma of our sometimes even ancestors, but recent sort of family members, how that can sometimes be passed over
through genetics
through genetics, or sometimes even if we kind of try and bring it as closely as we can. Let's say a mother is particularly stressed, anxious, traumatized. Child might be in the womb. What are your thoughts about that? Is there something there? Is that a valid potential idea?
Look, like you, I'm interested, but I don't know a lot about it. But it sounds very plausible to me. I mean, yes, I think it's plausible. I honestly don't know the research or so I'm not sure. But I do believe that we learn in the womb. There's no question about that. If you've got a refugee mother who's anxious and trying to escape, say, Southeast Asia to come to Australia, well, the world's a scary place for that baby that's born. Now, whether the anxiety of the mother and the experiences she had, trauma, whatever else, turns on certain genetic triplets and turns off others, I don't know, but I think that's something like the mechanism that's been proposed. It sounds plausible, but I honestly don't know the research. I'd be on a very much a popular science sort of level of looking at it.
Sure. Your book looks more at that. Your writing looks more at what happens post-birth.
Yes, the new book I'm writing is post, a little bit in the womb, but certainly not going back to the genetic code. But yeah, I look at it, the early experiences through Aristotle's 5 senses: sight, taste, hearing, touch, smell, etc. Those senses, all those senses. So I look at the earliest sense perceptions.
I know that when my wife and I were going to have our first, as excited and
Yes.
and probably new age parents, you go and you read everything, you go crazy in that sort of space. But we came across some literature which said let's go out and hold our child, skin on skin touch.
Yes.
and how important that is. And look, I don't know whether it's valid to say it must happen immediately, but there is something absolutely beautiful and comforting, being the outside and watching my daughter be held by my wife.
Beautiful. Yes.
In this moment where, birth has just occurred and they've entered the world and mum's providing everything that she needs to do, which is just to comfort and
You
to
can
cuddle.
see how much the child appreciates it, the snuggles in. I mean, I was on a plane with somebody and they had this sort of papoose sort of thing on the front, and it was just gorgeous to see the mother bond with the child in that way. So I'm a grandparent now, but it's beautiful to see it. And I know two of my daughters are psychologists, and they read everything as like you and your wife, and then tried to be as intentional parents as they were able, and I think they were highly successful.
Hope my 2 daughters become psychologists as well.
We'll get them to study hard. Well, actually, my 3 daughters are 2 are psychologists who've done clinical, and my other daughter was a nurse who went and became a sex therapist. So that's weird for a dad, I've got to tell you. But she's very good, and she's got a private practice, Kim Robinson, so I'll give you a plug there. And she's a brilliant therapist. I mean, she's just absolutely outstanding.
Where's Kim?
She's actually at Canberra Clinical in the offices.
Oh, okay.
So
Yes,
I've given her an office, and she's got a practice there as well. Rowena's got an office there.
Fantastic.
The other daughter is in Melbourne, but yeah.
What's the trick? How do I get my daughters to go out and follow after dad?
Well, my theory was that they saw me earning money by just simply sitting on my backside. So it looked easy money.
So I've got to look relaxed.
While they're doing their ironing for $1 an hour, you just silently drop that you're earning, whatever you earn, and you're just sitting down and not ironing. They get the message.
Point taken. I will be going straight home, getting him started.
And the other trick is that I think's a good one, and this is my wife came up with this idea, and it was absolutely a gem. Was whatever their bedtime is, let's say it's 7:30 in bed, you give them an extra half hour if they're laying in bed and reading. They can read anything they want.
I like it.
Anything you want, but you have an extra half hour up if you read. And they can read Harry Potter or whatever they want to read. Don't limit it, but get them used to reading for pleasure. Because, psychologists or medicine or law are people these days who read. And people that are always on machines or, Facebook or something, they're not getting used to a written literary style of communication, which is essential for the professions. So people are ruling themselves out by not reading. And most people read one book every 6 months, if that.
That is absolutely brilliant.
It's a very simple tactic. And Jenny worked that one out, and I think she just nailed it. And I think all the kids and my grandkids so far are readers. My oldest grandchild reads probably 3 books a week at the very least. And I saw her on Sunday, and she was reading a book that was like telephone book thick, So she's 9 years old.
That's what's impressive. You meet some really impressive characters, and one thing that's quite commonly correlated there is they're vast and avid readers, and
Exactly.
and not always on just a topic. They read broadly. It's quite fascinating, and to start that early, gosh, things are going to change in my household now.
Well, the other thing is that reading, who are the great psychologists? I mean, we've named them, you've named your rooms after them, but there are also Charles Dickens and Shakespeare, Dante, Augustine with his Confessions. These are the great
Yes.
Aristotle was the first probably great psychologist. So we need to read these people. So it's not just the psychology textbooks or the pop psychology textbooks. It's actually the great Dostoevsky, the great writers of history, Camus in the 20th century. I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre. All these people, these are the real psychologists. And after you've done your master's degree or PhD in psychology, you actually have the time to read the real psychologists.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Bruce, how can people get in touch with you? How can people find out more about you? And when are you releasing this book?
It's with the publisher at the moment being considered. Look, there's lots of ways to contact me. I'm a professor at Charles Sturt University, so there is just go through Charles Sturt and the web and just put my name in and it'll come to me, and I'm happy to receive emails. My website on early spirituality is www.earlyspirituality.com. And in fact, there's a free book that has schemas in it, which if you register on that site, just simply as a sort of register with whatever I don't know what it's called, but you can actually get a free copy of the book, a PDF of it, and I'm happy.
You put in your email and it sends it to you and you get
it sends it to you. You put in your email address and it'll send it to you. So there's a reward for that.
Fantastic. Bruce, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really look forward to getting you back on somehow. I know you've got a busy schedule. We could probably talk about raising kids. It sounds like I need to find out more. But it's been great and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nesh. It's been absolutely delightful to catch up with you again.
If you enjoyed this podcast with Bruce Stevens, and I'm sure you did because it was a ripper, make sure you go out and subscribe so that you get future podcasts, and also share. It would mean the world to me. If you haven't already done so, also reach out and connect with me at neshnikolic.com/LinkedIn.